Hi, I'm Laura.
Hey, I'm Stefan, and you're listening to Attributed, a podcast library by Dreamdata.
The purpose of it is to store and share all the knowledge that we have gathered across Dreamdata employees through our LinkedIn Lives, podcasts, and webinars.
The typical topics you'll find here can be stuff like marketing,
Sales,
B2B ads,
operations,
social selling maybe.
Hello and good morning or good afternoon, depending on whether you're in Europe or in North America right now. It's great to be live yet again to another attributed session brought to you by Dreamdata. Today we're doing a very seasonal topic for B2B marketers, which is the budgeting and planning for a new year. And to be honest, this is not something that I am super duper good at. So I thought for today, it's probably better to involve some of the very experienced B2B marketing leaders that we have using the Dreamdata product that are good friends of the house to help us educate ourselves on this topic. Just to underline the trendiness or the seasonality of this conversation that we're having today. We shipped our newsletter yesterday at 180 signups to the LinkedIn event. And by now we've passed 420 signups to this event. So it seems like there's a lot of people out there right now trying to figure out where to place their bets for next year. And that's why I'm super happy to have all three of you here today. Before we get started, I would love us to do just a quick tour of who's actually that is here, besides the titles that everybody can see. So David, maybe you can start and just do the 1 minute tour of who you are, where you work, and maybe who's buying the Bird product normally.
Sure thing. Thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate the invitation. And hello, everyone. So my name is David, 30 years old. I'm based in wonderful Vienna. So it's already the afternoon for me, luckily. And yeah, I joined Bird a bit more than 8 years ago on the day of the foundation, basically. Back then, still as a student, then decided to join the company full-time in 2018. What do we do? So we're not the e-scooter company. We provide tech-enabled e-commerce logistics solution to online merchants. So our typical customer is an online seller that is using a technology like Shopify, selling on a marketplace like Amazon, typically between 5 to 20,000 orders a month. And having the ambition to grow internationally since we built a European fulfillment network now active in 7 markets in Europe. And yeah, I think that's a very short and brief summary.
Cool. Let's do the other Alex in Europe. Alex Venus, maybe 1 minute about you and your background.
Cool. Yes, I'm Alex. I'm based in London and I work for a company called Personio. Personio is hopefully the only HR platform you'll ever need. We're a HR SaaS and allow sort of HR managers and often founders of businesses as well to automate all of their people processes from onboarding, recruitment, payroll, and booking holidays and stuff like that. My background is always been digital marketing and actually in HR SaaS for several of the past years, working at enterprise companies like Workday, scale ups like Peakon, and sort of previously before that as well, and more of like a marketing automation background. My role at Personio is driving pipeline and also creating demand through paid acquisition, hopefully improving the user experience on the website, and also through PLG programs as well, which means like demo optimization and trial optimizations. Really excited about today. Very, very topical. I'm sure we've got a lot to discuss on budgets. It's stuff that I'm doing outside of this call as well. So yeah, really excited to hear everyone's takes.
Wonderful. And then Alex in Canada.
Hi, Stefan. Thanks for having me. My name is Alex Shipillo. I'm VP of Growth Marketing at Clio. We're the leading cloud-based technology for the legal industry. So if you think about what a small to mid-sized law firm needs to run their business, everything from documents to billing, invoicing, timekeeping, calendar, scheduling, that's Clio in a nutshell. We've grown to just north of $200 million annualized recurring revenue, and we have about 150,000 legal professionals using Clio in 130 countries. So quite a bit of scale and growing quickly, which is actually probably the funnest part about the planning and budgeting cycle. It's hard when the growth rate is big because you're making assumptions going to next year without even knowing where this year is going to finish yet. And I think that's a really challenging but important part of the planning process. So thank you for having me.
Fantastic, Alex. And maybe you can just lead into a quick round of what does budgeting season typically look like at Clio? When does it start? Who starts nagging you for answers and budgets and all that stuff?
Yeah, great question. So I think to maybe preface even before we get to Clio is I don't think I've ever been part of a good planning process. So I think part of what I try to set the team's expectations around is like, what does success look like? And it probably doesn't mean things like amazing or great. It probably means things like better than last year, right? And like, how do we do things better than we did last year? So last year at Clio, we actually did something good, which was we actually started the planning process much earlier. We're on a calendar fiscal year, so December 31st is the last day of this year, and Jan 1 is the first day of the next year. And we had typically started most of the budgeting process in October, running through December. And last year we bumped it up 3 months. So really, most of the planning happened from July through September, where by the end of September we felt pretty locked in with our headcounts, our company targets, and our budgets. And then that left Q4, so October, November, to really finalize the marketing specific plans. So what each individual marketing teams were doing. And going through that process at the time, I can't stress how painful that was for the team, because if you think about September, October, those are some of the busiest months of the year for us. They were so heads down executing that it was really hard for them to make the time to be able to actually perform. But guess what? When January hit, we had our best January ever, because the team had actually decided ahead of time what they were doing, and everything was kind of locked in that process. So we're trying to do the same thing again this year. A lot of the company-wide planning, so overall like budgets, headcount, targets happens in the summer. And then the time period right now is really focused to provide the marketing team the data and insights to figure out how they want to plan. So we have a pretty large marketing team. Our marketing team is about 105 people today. So we've actually split up into about 20 planning groups. Those are based on different segments for our business, different channels, things like SEO, website optimization, funnel optimization. Each of those planning groups has a timeline for them to deliver kind of like their brief and their plans, their asks with rounds of reviews. So right now the team is heavily focusing on that. And I know it's their priority is to get that locked in so that we can hit January running.
A very impressive size that you guys have reached, but it seems like you've found a positive outcome of actually utilizing it to have conversations about what to spend your marketing time and capacity on.
Yeah, I think it's super hard. Like I want to be kind of clear about that. Like the team is struggling to do this. And I think the struggle is because if you're in a fast-paced marketing organization, you're trying to execute, right? And it's no one says, okay, stop executing for 3 months so you can plan an amazing year next year, right? No team's going to give you that permission. So I think it really is about creating space physically in your calendar, creating space in your brain to really sit down and jot down what you have in place. We've been pretty flexible in the formats. And last year was more presentation focused, where maybe people put slides decks together, but we realized it wasn't very collaborative. And it meant more focusing on the presentation style than it was the actual content. So this year we moved more to documents that have, where we're asking people to kind of use a template and use a document to fill out, where it's easier to kind of comment and share and provide feedback on it. But it's hard. It's hard to create the space for it. It's hard for everybody. I don't think there's anyone who's successful at doing that unless they've got so much time in their calendar to be able to do that and allocate for that planning process.
Yeah, and I know the feeling of just being in the trenches as well, and then being forced to look 6 or 12 months ahead. That can be a struggle sometimes. Alex, in Personio, does the planning process look similar, or how does it look in your company?
Yeah, it's definitely changed. I think these things might sound like they're not the most critical aspect. Like, what format are people presenting their bottom-up forecasts in, and how are people working together? But I actually found that these things are really critical to how successful these cycles have been. This year, we've made quite a lot of change. And the main change in that format is we've tried to really condense it. Just a little bit about context about Personio. Q4 is our biggest quarter for us in terms of ARR. And so I think the biggest challenge for us has always been, one, as we've been scaling so fast, our organization, our complexity, but also where, who people are, people that you don't know in different offices and that sort of stuff, you lose touch and it can become quite chaotic. And the other thing that's always sort of been a problem from like a top-down model in terms of budget planning in particular is the goalposts are moving every day because you're in your biggest quarter where stuff is changing. So, growth rates for next year, investment models, this sort of stuff, it's very difficult to place where you're going to be when effectively the target is moving all the time or your pacing's moving all the time. This year, we made a bit of a step change in it. And the main one was we went from having budget process, which, if you're really honest, was around sort of really 3 to 4 months. And there was even calibrations that were taking place into the following year, just due to how much stuff gets closed at the end of December. And I'm being pretty honest in that respect. And now what we tried to do is put it down to like a 3-week sprint, effectively, where you have a small pod of cross-functional leaders. And the way that is kind of roughly structured is you get top-down guidance based on existing pacing, and an investment model based on the growth rate for next year. Then we all came together face to face, and we all used exactly the same templates. Again, this is all pretty new. And just as Alex said, it's not about, who's got a 70-point sort of page slide deck with custom animations. No one cares about that. It's about kind of getting the basics and assumptions that you have like a real high confidence in on paper and discussing them cross-functionally. Because I think as well, the most critical thing, and budget cycles where I've seen the most success, it's where you're not waiting for top-down guidance every other week from finance in the Slack channel. You're talking to them, over coffee, face-to-face. You're getting real-time feedback on, what's the take from what I've just presented to the CEO? How does he feel about that? What's the finance person do about that? And you're working in real time. And just seeing it all kind of come together is definitely I don't think these things are ever perfect. And yes, there's always a degree of movement as Q4 is underway. But I think just having that real-time feedback, cutting out all the fluff of relevant presentations, has been really, really key to streamlining our budget process. And I imagine there'll probably still be a couple of calibrations. Maybe I'll look back on this and go, oh, how naive Alex was a couple of weeks ago. But in general, it feels like we're now a lot more on the same page, and having that sort of face-to-face real-time contact was good. And then after that, there's only really 1 week. So it's basically collect your bottoms-up plan based on top-down guidance in terms of growth rate and like GTM efficiency. Present that, align on that, do that all within a couple of days. And they were long days in the office, but we had everyone in there from different functions. And then the week after that, it's just making those final revisions to the plan overall. So it's a lot more intensive. And yes, you can't really balance execution at that time. You need to obviously devolve that if you're a leader, but overall it feels a lot more efficient. And the big ramifications of this, I've always found, is if you go down that previous state I was talking about, and you have these like dozens of calibrations afterwards, the impact that's having to other teams in terms of how they're able to execute, creating sort of dozens of media plans versus one media plan, or adjusting these things, creates so much inefficiency. So my advice is always, work cross-functionally in a small pod, try and get it like one and done, or with as few calibrations as possible, and really have that like opportunity, if possible, for real-time feedback versus doing it across a multitude of different Slack channels, because it creates so much inefficiency.
Seems like there's you don't get through it without a lot of stakeholder management and communication. Before we get into more detail, David, I want to ask you, so the two other gentlemen are working in companies with more than 1,000 employees. At Bird, you're around the 200 mark. Does the budgeting process look similar there, or is it different?
I just want to say, I think we still work on a slightly smaller scale, and probably we have less iterations when it comes also to budgeting. I think there's probably less complexity, especially hearing Alex Shipillo's story also about having the budgeting starting already the month of July, right? For us, we're still in the budgeting process now for next year. And I would say in our cases, it has changed quite a bit over years, always depending on the growth stage and the funding rounds that we had completed. Probably also both Alex can confirm that this has implications on the growth targets that will be set, and basically the top-down goals and budget that you will receive initially. And how it works at Bird at the moment and over the last few years is that we basically, based on the funding round and also expectations from investors and also from the board in general, what needs to be achieved, we get the top-down goal setting and budgeting. And then the commercial leaders, so especially our VP commercial, chief commercial officer, and myself, we sit together and basically look at the growth targets, the budget. And then I work with my team saying, okay, for marketing sourced leads, we can expect that amount of revenue. Then sales from there, and they will share their realistic expectations for the upcoming year. and then we identify the gaps that are still left and how we can close them. And then if basically we need to get more budget and so on, then we work on the fine tuning as a team. And that's basically how we roll at the moment, which is quite tedious, I would say sometimes. And also since the market has evolved quite a bit over the last few years, so we're also one of the first tech-driven e-commerce fulfillment companies in the space. And when we started, there was not that much competition. Then basically we thought, oh, okay, cool. So if we continue to increase the budget like this, then we will basically just get so many more leads and so many more customers. But obviously then you have competitors popping up here and there in different markets. Things get a lot more expensive, and then you have to adjust also the planning. So that's something that we learned to take into consideration, that you cannot set the goals in stone at the end of the year, and you need to be also agile basically throughout the year. So yeah, just my 2 cents also.
I wanted to ask kind of is for maybe to all of you, it sounded like you, David, you're setting the marketing budget and plans based on like a certain metric you need to hit. Is that the same for Alex and Alex? Or is it like, here's the budget, go do with it what you can? Or what is kind of that main input you get top down to marketing? Alex, Clio, you can maybe start.
Yeah, I think at our size and scale, being at more than 1,000 employees, we have a pretty good idea of what kind of growth rate we're trying to get to as a business. And most of the business at Clio is marketing driven. So marketing is the biggest input to our overall growth. So we know we got to be pretty close to that number overall. So what Alex Venus was saying about going back and forth from a guidance standpoint, we actually can pretty early on in the planning process go to our team, our marketing team, our functional owners and say, hey, like it's going to be around this number, right? We have a pretty good idea of where that growth rate's going to be and where we're going to need to sign up for regardless. And it's just a function of scale. I think, as the bigger you get, the bigger the denominator gets in that growth equation. And, we're a high growth company. We're being valued like a high growth company. We want to continue being down that process. So we have a pretty good idea of what that kind of looks like from a number standpoint. And then, I think that to really, the range of budgets and the MQL growth rates and other variables are all going to be pretty close to that level.
Alex Venus, is that the same in Personio?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us in terms of it's different for our more established markets, which are definitely DACH, where again, it's kind of where we originated from. It's where the majority of our revenue is. It's far more predictable. I think if you're a seed round company or early stage company, I'm sure there'll be quite a few people listening to this that may be in that same boat. You understand the volatility that's there, both through external factors and internal factors. So that's why it comes down to when you're making these growth forecasts and you have this assumption model, you have this formula that you're basing your growth rate on. It's key to really be baking that on things that you have a very, very high confidence on. Otherwise, you're particularly at the moment, you're going to be putting yourself at high risk of missing that. But yeah, to answer your question, Stefan, I think the two ones are the growth rate. So we know that within, like 1-2% sort of deviation. And then the second one is, call it CAC payback, but I think for us, it's more around sort of like GTM efficiency. We're sort of an organization as well. We haven't been around forever, and particularly in some markets. And I know there's a big change in culture around this, where people were using assumptive LTVs before within their sort of growth formula, and without even knowing how long they were going to have these customers for. And that's, I think, a real thing that I see kind of changing at the moment. I've listened to quite a few podcasts on this recently, where you shouldn't be assumptive about LTV anymore, because you don't know what's kind of coming up or what competitors are going to arrive or where your churn's going to be in a few years' time. So you need to be looking at GTM efficiency more in terms of more like a sort of a short to medium payback period. So for us, we look at it in terms of payback period, or call it ROI, and trying to get to that ROI as quickly as possible. And for us, this means that we're probably more revenue oriented than we used to be, and really focusing on things that pay back in terms of that shorter ROI. But at the same time, you can't just go down that route, right? Because your company hopefully should exist after 2025. So you always need to have that degree still. And that's always the challenge that we have as marketers in what's that spend that you're putting into your budget. That's more upper funnel brand awareness. and making that sort of a blended with your sort of overall investment model overall. But yeah, it's 2 metrics, CAC payback for us. So, looking at that year just in isolation, total investment versus ROI, like what's the payback period on that? And we look at kind of benchmarks and where we want to be overall. And obviously with the whole sort of operating model for the company. And then, that growth rate number, which comes top down from the finance function.
Wonderful. That's a perfect segue to change chapter a little bit, going from what does the process look like to maybe talking a bit about how you guys where you're placing your bets for next year. What are the things that have made it into your budgets? What are the things that have moved out of your budgets? But like broadly speaking, maybe David, you can start. How do you think about placing the marketing budget for a new year?
Yeah, I think Alex mentioned a good point about focusing more on the revenue metrics also, and becoming more of a revenue marketing organization. Is also something that we have seen and how we have evolved over time. So we used to focus a lot, especially in the early days. Okay, we have to get the marketing and sales qualified leads in, and basically we would evaluate very quickly the performance of different campaigns and channels based on that metric. What we have seen now, especially with a very tough e-commerce market with players like Shein and Temu and so on, it's like there is a lot of competition, and e-commerce was struggling, especially in Germany, quite a bit. And what we have seen is that many of those leads that we converted, they didn't turn into actual revenue. So now we're really focusing more on ICP fit and making sure that the e-commerce merchants that are reaching out, they really have potential to grow with us, because our model makes a lot of sense if you have this international growth ambition. So we evaluate the performance of the channels and campaigns really on the deal generation and actually the revenue that is coming in, and also the MRR conversion, because we don't have this typical SaaS model where basically you close a company and then okay, you will have constant subscription coming in. So it really depends on their success on the e-commerce market. So we focus really on the quality of the companies that are reaching out to us, and this is where we place our bets on. So not too much on, okay, this is a channel that can generate a lot of leads and we can get a lot of awareness, but really being very specific about the targeting, making sure that we attract e-commerce brands that have the potential to grow internationally with us. And this is what we are planning now for next year, also to focus on those campaigns. And maybe just a word also regarding the planning for next year. So now we're approaching peak, right? So everyone is getting ready to buy Christmas presents soonish. Christmas markets are opening this week, actually, in Vienna. So this is the busy season for e-commerce, right? And then after this, in Q1, this is one of the most critical periods for us. So we always get ready for this in time, because in that period, e-commerce retailers are reevaluating their supply chain setup. They might face a lot of issues during peak with delayed orders and other issues that might occur, because it's a very stressful time. They might have problems with their 3PL and look for alternative solutions. So we try to build already this awareness now in Q4, and then really go into remarketing and front loading the marketing budget into Q1, basically, to capture the demand then. And this is one of the most important timings for us to just get a good kickstart into the year. And if we do this right, then we know that that's going to be a good year. And then we're just focusing on those channels where, as I said, we believe that we can really reach those high potentials, I would call them.
A really good points about this, knowing the seasonality of the market that you're in. Like, if everybody's making decisions in Q1, you don't want to evenly distribute the budget throughout the year. Alex, Shipillo, how do you decide if you have 100% pie? Where does the budget go for you?
Yeah, I think one way of thinking about this is it doesn't matter how big your business is, but break down your business into whatever chunks you can. And I think ask yourself the question, like, is this chunk going to be, same importance a year from now, less important, or more important? It's a very simple way. And you could probably align quite easily without having the rough numbers of aligning around that. So I think we look at our business and we say, okay, like what chunks are going to be a lot more important a year from now, right? And in our case, for example, we're starting to move up market in a much bigger way. So most of our customers are small law firms, like 1 to 20 employees, but our fastest growing segment is 20 to 200. So we know that's the fastest growing part of business. We're seeing some success from those investments. So we're putting more budget towards that in 2025. Similarly, on the international expansion front, we launched Australia 2 years ago. We're seeing really good success. It's growing at a much faster clip than the rest of our business. We know we're going to be doubling down there and putting more resources towards it. And I think same thing on the channel level, right? I think, at a baseline, most people start their budget by copying and pasting what they had last year. Like that's the starting point, right? And then I think you look at those things and you say, okay, let's say my hypothetical growth rate is, let's say 50%. I want to grow 50% next year as a business. I know that's a lot, but is this channel capable of getting me to 50%, right? Is this something that's has that potential? Or is this a 20% channel, or is it a 100% channel, right? I think thinking about those bets as saying, hey, what's the potential of this? How much could it scale? How much bigger can it be? That's sort of the first question that we think about when we look at some of those areas. Not every channel has potential for more scale, and you don't need every channel to be a high growth one. You want some to be solid bets that are going to be consistent. But I think that's sort of that thinking of, is this going to be bigger, smaller, or the same a year from now, is probably the right categorization to start saying, okay, where do I want to put some of the bigger bets in place?
That's really good. And when you talk about percentages, it's basically how much of the pipeline that you are to deliver that it can take, or how is it?
Yeah, I think about year over year. Like, so if my team's target year over year is 50% growth, for example, whatever metric I pick, MQLs or revenue or ROA, I don't know, whatever you want to do. So I look at that channel and I say, can this segment do 50% more? Can this channel do 50% more? Can this piece do that? And you probably have a pretty good idea, right? You'll probably have historicals. You might have some limitations. You might say, oh, we've maxed out review size. I don't think Capterra's got more volume than we can take, right? Like whatever those things are. And then you'll be able to kind of answer that question. But I think that really, you almost need to have the mindset of saying, like, is this investment a growth investment? Like something that's going to exceed the curve that I'm trying to get to and I can put more into? Or is it a stable investment? Like it's going to do well. It's going to grow a little bit, but it probably isn't going to make my number by itself, or it might be a flat or declining one, which is fine too, right? Like not every, marketers abuse every channel until it no longer works, right? So, they're going to have some things that are actually having diminishing returns. That's okay too. I think early on in the planning process, as you're trying to allocate budget, you almost need to understand what that looks like. And frankly, I've got people on my team coming to me saying, hey, like, how do I get more resources for this program? Like, how do I get more resources for more people resources usually is the question, for this investment, for this channel, for this thing. And I say, how do we make the case for this to be a growth lever, right? Make the case this thing can grow faster than the rest of our business. That's going to be the biggest thing that's going to help us determine if we can invest more resources into that or not.
That's super good advice. And I can see myself doing that exercise of taking last year's budget and then doing the below or above the growth rate that we're looking for.
Yeah,
it makes a lot of sense. Alex Venus, how have you been focusing for placing this next year's budget?
Yeah, I think Alex covered a lot of the essentials there. I think the first part is that metric. So if you're looking at revenue, or you're looking at that sort of total ROI, that GTM efficiency that I was speaking about earlier on, then you can make that assessment on channels. You'll know that certain channels are we're also shifting our market and sort of narrowing our ICP to a degree as well, and so you can do that analysis as to where people are coming from right now. So maybe you could isolate certain keywords that are driving the right sort of segment, or you could look at channels where you feel like maybe there's a scope to improve a bit more in demand capture. I think also for certain channels, if you've been leveraging for a certain period of time, the spend and the proportion of your total spend is almost dictated for you, particularly when it comes down to demand capture and like search channels. If you've got the search visibility, the ROAS that you want to have, and the performance that's there, and also you're not trying to radically adjust your audience next year, then that's kind of dictated for you, right? So that portion of the pie it takes to remain and keep that degree of search visibility, bar maybe a couple of extra competitors kind of jumping into the mix or something changing externally, is kind of taken care of for you. So I generally start in demand capture first, but demand capture can mean a whole multitude of things. It doesn't necessarily mean paid. It could also mean organic or zero, whatever it is. But in general, I look at what it takes to maintain that sort of like 2% demand capture within your funnel, and then go from there. And then the other thing I'm looking at as I say earlier on is around kind of where do we get that reach from? So how we reaching the audience, and I think I spoke to you about this in a previous video, Stefan, around I'd far rather be going like toe-to-toe competitors on creative versus ad spend. So where do we feel like we can outperform people and like a stronger ROI just through creative testing versus outbidding them, because that's obviously more of a scalable model potentially. So that's kind of how I look at it. Start with demand capture. What's like a set state that I can't really play around with? What does that give me? Like, what does that look like in terms of ROAS? And then also, as I mentioned earlier on in the, what does that look like if you're ICP? So yeah, I definitely agree that like just copy and pasting the same media plan, if your growth rate, ICP, and all that sort of stuff is radically changing next year, is a terrible idea, because what got you here won't get you there is very much a sentiment that we have at Personio. But if all things are remaining kind of the same, you're looking at just like a 10-20% growth rate, say 10 or just 10-20% growth rate increase, then maybe you can look at iterative changes on a media plan. But for us next year, we'll probably make quite big changes in certain markets, particularly the growth markets, where maybe historically we were taking like more of a kind of a carbon clone from like our more established markets and trying to apply that to growth markets, which in general is not the best idea to approach it. So in general, it depends. But I'd usually start with like the things that you can't really dictate, which is how much does it cost to convert for like the keywords that are driving pipeline and revenue for you and stuff like that, and then see what's left afterwards for demand creation and brand.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And as you say, that there's just a certain amount of people in the world that searches for HR software. And when you've exhausted that, there's no more search to buy. So you can put that budget line in there. See, we're starting to get some questions here about something that I had in mind for you guys as well. And that is kind of the classic, I'll pull up Shashwat's question here. Should the brand versus performance marketing be at a 40 to 60% ratio? Like, how much of the budget goes into like proven demand generation channels, and how much do you put into brand awareness? I don't know, you, Alex Venus, I don't know if you've changed your mind, but you have at least started to put more budget into the brand part of it. David, how do you think about that split at Bird?
I think especially now in times where budgets are fairly tight, we focus, as also Alex said now, on the demand capture channels that we know that they are working. So we try to continue to invest in those, because we've seen a really good track record, and it really generates a significant pipeline revenue for us. So if we would basically shift too much into branding, I think there would be a high risk of basically not reaching the growth targets. So obviously you don't want to risk that. So from our perspective, at the moment we're investing roughly 70% actually into the demand gen channels, I would say, that fairly like on the lower end of the funnel. And then we have roughly 15 to 20% that go into demand creation, brand awareness, how you want to put it. And then we have some experimentation budgets that we also shift throughout the year. But it also depends on the market. So in the more established markets, like in Germany or the DACH region in general, we invest a bit less into brands, because we already have a pretty good brand awareness here. And I think from experience, we can tell that we're top of mind for most or for many of the e-commerce companies that would fall into our ICP segment. But in newer channel markets like Italy and Spain, we still try to run a bit more of the brand awareness campaigns, because it's still needed to build the brand in those markets. So yeah, that's how we do it at the moment. So still more than the 60%, what was that? I think 40%.
Alex, how does it look at Clio today, and has it changed over time? You've been part of an amazing growth journey, I know.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't think we've actually deliberately said, hey, this is the target for how much brand versus performance is. I think we go back to the question of what's possible, what can grow, right? And even for a lot of our demand channels or performance marketing channels, the budget there is infinite, right? Our CFO will write any check we want as long as we can show him more growth, show him more leads that can come in, that can close, right? I think what we the way we have that conversation is more what Alex Venus was saying earlier, what's possible on our performance marketing channels. If we harvested everything that could come in, what does that look like? What are those opportunities? And then we add on top of that. One thing that has been a part of Clio's culture from the very beginning, long before I've been here, is We just believe in the power of brand. We believe that, ultimately that's going to be one of our biggest differentiations when people are going to be choosing Clio, especially in a really competitive landscape with lots of different alternatives. So we do have like substantial portions of our budget that are allocated for very brand focused pieces. And a good example of that is we put on a massive customer conference for 3,000 plus attendees. And like, it's so hard to measure the impact of that and the ROI that it's driving. But I know from talking to customers and prospects that has an astronomical impact on our business. And it's really hard from that standpoint. So I think we look at a lot of those pieces. And then the other thing that I would say on the brands piece is a lot of the things you could do might not take as much budget, but are much more people or resource focused. So in our case, we put together like really compelling data called the Legal Trends Report. And it's the most comprehensive data in the legal industry. That takes a lot of time. It doesn't show up on an operating budget, but it definitely shows up on a headcount piece. Similarly, I think one of the biggest brand things we did in the last couple of years is our CEO wrote a book, and we've been really focusing on that side and a lot. And like there's costs to publishing a book. I don't want to diminish that, but they're pretty small. Like the real cost is the time and effort of the people that are involved in putting that together and marketing those areas. So I think a lot of the brand work and the brand impact really can come from people's time, not even necessarily creative or advertising or that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because we also spend a lot of time producing content, and it's not like we hand money over to Facebook every time we do that. It's the salary that we pay or the time that we invest in it. You just said something, Alex, there that I just should be like put up a bit on the pedestal, that you have a relationship with the CFO where if you can actually go say to him, this channel can give me XYZ, then he'll pay the bill for those experiments. How have you gotten that relationship into that state with the CFO or whoever it is that you talk budgets with?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think it starts with having like a really good product with really good economics. Like that's the starting point around it. Alex Venus talked about having, predictable lifetime value and knowing what your acquisition costs are. And I think we're really lucky at Clio is like, we've got a great product that's really sticky. It's got, people are going to be using it for a very long time. We've got a really strong market leadership position. We're growing quickly. So the environment is right. If you have all those pieces, you're in market capture mode. And, the mindset on the company is like, we feel really confident we can acquire customers today and have them be around for a long time. We're also growing as a multi-product organization as well. So we're really confident that the products people buy today are going to expand to additional products down the road. So I think there's a lot of environments that need to happen to do that. I think the second case comes back to some of the reasons why we're probably all using Dream Data is like, you want to educate your financial leadership about how you're spending the money, right? You want to tell that story of what data looks like. And we've evolved massively over the time that I've been in Clio in terms of how we talk about how we spend money, how we report on it, how we show growth, how we describe ROAS. We've changed our models to talk about things. And that's communicated pretty broadly on the executive level because it's pretty important, right? And marketing usually has a lot of responsibility for budget and organization. So we have a lot of responsibility to actually show up that piece. And then I think the third thing is like, what are the individual specifics of that conversation? And I think before you go to the CFO and say, hey, I need more money, I think you got to say like, is there existing money we have in our programs already that we can move or allocate towards this? And I bet you most times the answer is going to be yes. You're never going to be running a marketing budget where everyone's running to 100%. And in fact, every year that I've ever been part of any marketing budget, we generally underspend. We generally get towards that place. And an old CMO boss of mine said like the worst thing is actually not to overspend. The worst thing is to underspend, because then if you underspend and you didn't hit your targets, you're actually in an even worse position because you had more resources you didn't leverage to get to where you want to be. So I think before you go to that CFO and make that ask, I think look internally and say, hey, what can we move or shift? And in our world, we're actually looking every single week to see if there's things we can shift. And our performance marketing team is probably the biggest place where they are able to capture the extra budget. But like Alex Venus said, we don't know how much demand there's going to be in Google in a given month, but we have a good idea halfway through to say, we think we're going to be pacing above, we think we're pacing below, we think there's more room here. And we'll shift that mid-month and make some of those calls basically every single month.
Super nice. And I think that this really speaks to marketing being more proactive about both saving costs. If there's stuff that is not ineffective, just stop them and move that money into places where you know that it works. And also when you're speaking with economically minded people, make sure that you're actually able to speak their language, not just talk about marketing metrics, but talk about how much pipeline or how much revenue that you bring in. I'm curious to hear.
I think just that point that Alex was saying, I think is really clear. And what I've kind of really liked about Alex's answers there as well, it sounds like there's like a real kind of culture of sort of honesty and transparency when it comes to budgets as well. I've definitely worked in organizations before where that hasn't been the case, where, it's almost been like, you're trying to inflate the envelope or being territorial about the budget or padding the budget or sandbagging it. Like if you're really serious about growth, I don't think you can really have that type of culture when it comes to finances. You need to have open dialogue with all cost center owners. You need to have that degree of flexibility as you're going for a quarter or you're going for a half and you're going, actually, it makes sense if we shift this budget over here. And you really focus overall on growth and not necessarily on how it impacts channel attribution or how it impacts like the ROI from certain channels. And you look bigger picture. And I think that's definitely like a key culture and that you need to have in an organization where you think more selflessly in terms of how that's actually going to impact the bottom line. And you can have that, mid-quarter conversation with your CFO, or you can speak to another budget leader and you think, actually, let's shift it from performance marketing into brand, or let's shift it into, creative and design or a marketing infrastructure project. So you need to have that degree of flexibility so that you can be adaptable throughout the year, but you also need that culture as well on budget. So you can have that open dialogue with other people and think ultimately what's going to impact the bottom line. Because as we all know, attribution skews things in a certain way anyway. And obviously, with Dream Data, it's helped, but there's still a degree of ambiguity on these things. So I definitely think that open communication is so critical to actually making the most out of your budget.
Really great advice, Alex, as well. If we look towards 2025, are there any certain things that you want to mention that you have either moved into the budget or stuff that you've taken out of the budget to kind of share kind of where's your attention at the moment in terms of what's moving in marketing?
Yeah, I can start. So I think looking back at the last few years, we were not super satisfied with the performance of trade fairs that we attended, for example. So we actually decided to already last year to shift, or this year still, to shift some of the budget from trade fairs and events into performance marketing or paid media activities, because we saw that this would generate better results for the pipeline. So this is something that we have done and we will continue also for next year. Just maybe as is mentioned with the newer markets, so the ones that we entered to just recently more or less, to still build the presence there, the brand presence, but apart from that, really focus more on the channels that really show the best performance for the pipeline. So this is something that we have already decided on. And other than that, I think that one thing that's interesting to observe at the moment is that many of the moving away a bit from the media planning, but into tools also, that many of the tools that we're using are now starting to implement some of the AI features. So we've seen that now HubSpot has released some stuff. I think it's still not working super well right now, but I think it's going to get there at some point to already think a bit ahead and see, okay, what is this going to cost if we want to unlock this additional feature, to already plan ahead in that regard, because I think it will be very powerful if you can basically have some budget for those additional features to improve the data quality, to improve also buyer intent. Apparently is coming now for HubSpot as well, and all kind of stuff. I think it can be what is a game changer also moving forward to have this, and instead of having then thousands of different tools, basically just stacking up this one tool that you're already using and that everyone is used to also, because it's always difficult to also get this mindset shift completed. If you have sales, account management, so on, working with HubSpot already, they already feel comfortable now with this tool. So just to leverage this a bit more. So yeah, that's my take.
Yeah, Alex Shipillo, what's moving into the or moving upwards in the Clio budget, and what's moving downwards?
Yeah, great question. One of the challenges I have with that is whenever we launch any marketing programs, our competitors copy them within a few days usually. So
Fair enough.
as the market leader, we don't talk as much about what the things are, but I think some of the segment pieces we talked about, we're targeting mid-sized and larger law firms, expanding quicker in Australia. I think those are two of the areas that we're definitely investing more into. I think one thing that is just so fascinating to me is if I look up and down our channels, I just see so much opportunity everywhere. Like I really look at, I can't point to a single thing and say, oh, we've optimized this to the last degree. Like there's no more room. And frankly, most channels are 60, 70, 50% of where they could be. And that's been something that's been really interesting for us, even with leveraging of how we use Dream Data, is like we've really assigned ownership to every part of the business and the marketing side and said, hey, this is what you're accountable for, this is where you're driving. And the actual number on their dashboard doesn't matter. What matters is can you grow that number next month, next quarter, and continue that process. And I think that's what's really interesting to me is I think if you've got, again, a great product like we do, and you've got good product market fit and a great brand, your channels are probably not even close to being tapped out in the vast majority of cases. And there's so much inefficiencies or new experimentation or other things you want to do. And the limiting factor is time. So where I'm spending more time in the planning process right now is less about do we do more or less of this, but more within each channel, what are the big bets that we really want to make sure we get right? And I find that the biggest challenge for our team is they spend too much of their time on small impact, small effort things. They're okay. Like that should be a good chunk of it, but it can't be the entire list of portfolios, and not enough time on like really colossal big impact things that might need alignment from sales or might need a different structure entirely, or might need to break things around that. Like, I think this is the time as a business to be having those conversations because, I think a lot about growth in terms of local maximums versus absolute maximums, right? You can optimize your business to a certain point, but eventually you need to break things. A good example of that is like maybe you've got you're running a certain way and then you change your go-to-market motion, or you change your ICPs, or you change how your leads get routed, or you change how your sales team is organized. So like those things are really hard for individual marketing leaders to come up with by themselves, but they need to be part of a planning process because I think those bigger shifts I've seen really create big impact for the business overall.
That's super interesting, and it's a total different world that the Alex Venus and Alex Shipillo lives in, where I dream that we're around 50. So even small good ideas can still lift the performance quite a lot. But for you guys with more than 1,000 employees, you really need to every year come up with a new bunny that's able to lift the growth rates quite significantly. How do you go about finding these like massively impactful things year on year? Alex Venus, how do you approach that in Personio?
I think for me, it's just obviously on the paid side, it's get as far away from sort of spray and pray lead gen as possible. And I think, we were definitely sort of too far that way a few years ago. So you always, if you're coming into an organization and you're super lean and you're maximized on demand capture and you have like a world-class design team, sweating the detail every day, you probably will struggle. But I definitely agree with Alex's point. I do get that question all the time. What's the next channel for next year? It's like probably none. Like it's really just maximizing the existing spend. And I think the opportunity in my mind with paid and performance marketing is it's always easier to increase your budget than it is to nail creative. And just as Alex mentioned as well, like the commodity is really never spend. It's always your time, focus, and your ability to sort of like sweat the detail a lot more. So I think that's the competitive advantage for me is, hiring motion designers, creative strategists, working with the data science team, speaking to data analysts and smarter people internally. That's the way that we've been able to find efficiency. And then even once you've gone through that process, you've done it for 12 months. In general, unfortunately, there's more efficiency to find. I definitely agree with Alex's sentiment about how far we've gone down a channel. I think for me, it's around, finding that efficiency on existing channels versus chasing new shiny things. There are definitely new technologies that I'm looking into. I agree that I always try to keep like a 5% budget buffer. Some of that is for, you know, seasonality. Some of that is for changing goalposts, but also some of that is to sometimes, not to contradict myself, look at new tools. So some things I'm looking at the moment are AI functionality around audience targeting, but also some tools around sort of account-based marketing as well. So it's mainly around that sort of area. But yeah, having that sort of flexibility to cut into existing spend and find efficiency is generally how I go about it. And finding those channels, as I mentioned before, where I can outperform my adversaries on creative versus just on settings. And I feel like, as a very, very rough rule, you're always going to get a higher uplift through strong creative than you are through operational excellence and best practice setup.
Just one thought also from my end. Sorry, Stefan, not sure if you wanted to say something.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I think one source of inspiration in order to find those big bets and basically not only make incremental improvements, but really radical improvements, is to understand your customer base better and to understand what are the current pain points. So joining shadowing calls with the sales team on a regular basis, and also to encourage the whole team. So we have some kind of like semi-automated process to do this, and really join on a regular basis to find out, okay, what are they talking about? What are the current pain points? How's the market has evolved? And then also actually just very stupidly, you can go to LinkedIn and look at some of the influencers within your customer base and see what they're posting about and what is being commented. And I think here you will find a lot of valuable information on how you could potentially translate this into new campaigns, new channels, or something like this, or finding a great content piece that is tackling just those pain points, and this could give you an additional boost. So from my point of view, this can be a really good source of inspiration.
Great. Okay, there's just 4 minutes left here. So I wanted maybe for all three of you to just think through what we've talked about so far, and maybe come up with like a summary of what's your best advice to approaching this planning and budgeting season. Alex Shipillo, you're the one who starts the earliest in general in a year. So maybe to summarize, kind of what's your input for B2B marketers out there about like planning and budgeting?
Yeah. I mean, I think it starts with number one, like create space for it, like create space and time. And, you know, if you're working, again, if you've got high expectations and high targets that are in quarter, in month, in year, it's super hard to get out of that headspace. You have to do it. You have to dedicate time and figure out how to do that. I think the second thing is like think big. Like there's, you know, you got, this is your chance to think through that stuff. I promise you, it's going to be easier to get bigger ideas through, or bigger cross-functional or go-to-market changes across now than it's going to be later mid-year to the year. So start putting together some of those ideas and some of those pieces. And then I saw a great quote recently, which I really agree with, which is basically saying like prioritization is such a key to the planning process. And the only way to really surface great ideas is if you cut your good ones. And that really resonated with me. Like, I think there's too much time in the planning and budgeting process that's being spent towards things that are like good, and not enough time towards some of those great pieces. And more likely than not, you know, most teams' limited capacity is not actually going to be their budget. It's going to be their people's time and their resources and where they're able to allocate those things. And that doesn't matter if you're a 2-person marketing team or a 100-person marketing team. So I really think like thinking about where you want to place your bets from a people and time standpoint is really where I think we need to really dedicate time for right now.
Yeah, I'm definitely guilty, and I think about it as being in the trenches or outside the trenches, and it's so easy to be in the trenches working on stuff, but then you lose sight of like, are we actually on the right trajectory? Are we just working on mediocre stuff, or is it really making an impact for our business? Alex Venus, your best advice for all the people in the middle of the budgeting trenches right now?
Yeah, I'll try and be super quick. So I'd definitely +1 to everything Alex said. I'd say like don't over-index on channels. Like try to think big picture and think like you're a CFO, certainly as a starting point. Like think about the real business outcomes that you're working towards. Don't look at like an MQL graph and think, oh, that could go up by 20%. Like think really on business impact. What's your ICP going to look like next year? What growth rate are you trying to get to? And if you're thinking about that as more as like a CEO or CFO, then like these leading indicators that really roll up into that will obviously kind of make a lot more sense when you're looking at like the ROAS overall of your media spend or whatever. So think big picture, think beyond FY25 as well. So don't just only think about demand capture and revenue in that year. And my point earlier on as well, like, you know, people that are in your finance org are going to be super smart, like work with your data analysts, work cross-functionally in small pods and +1. Yeah, set dedicated time. Don't try and squeeze this in between your one-to-ones and regular working week. You won't get it done, and it's such an inefficient way of doing it. And
David, you get to give the last advice here.
Yeah, I think the important stuff has been said already, so I can only echo what has been said before by the two Alex. But one thing that I would add on top, especially in my position right now at Birds and maybe also for other scale-ups at the moment, I would suggest to not over-engineer the planning also, and to try to find a setup to remain agile with certain thresholds, so that you say, okay, we're not going to cut our marketing budget completely, and we have certain thresholds and say, okay, this is the minimum amount of money that we need for those and those channels, and we can adjust those flexibly, as was also discussed beforehand, that you need to be in a position to shift the budgets flexibly, ideally. So just to keep that in mind and not be too strict about this in the planning process.
All right, that's it. Guys, thank you so much for taking the time to share your advice here. I really appreciate it, and I think everybody here listening learned a lot. To everybody who's listening to this conversation, if you liked it, if you go search where you listen to podcasts for Attributed, you'll find 200 more conversations like this. So there's plenty of more stuff to go listen to. I just want to say thank you for everybody here for spending your time with us. We really appreciate it. And if you have any ideas for a next seasonal topical question that we should pick up, just let me know on LinkedIn, Slack, or wherever we're connected. Everybody, thank you so much for spending the time, and have a great day ahead.
We hope you like listening to us. Subscribe to our podcast and the ones that we have been guests on.
And if you have any feedback for us, just do let us know. And should there be a guest that you think we should be talking to, then pitch us.
We're looking forward to seeing you.